Thank you everybody for coming. My name's Mark. I organise these things under the very cumbersome title Walthamstow-London Book Club. I wish I'd come up with a snappier title like Arse or something. I'm delighted that this evening we have our very first visitor from the United States. Actually from the United States, not Brick Smith, who is a Mancunian, really. We've claimed her for our own, Jason.
Yes, as you should, yeah.
I know. But yeah, as you know, we like to move across genres and explore different avenues, but we haven't yet gone as far as to explore outer space. And so Jason has come here to tell us all about his fabulous new book. There you go. Publisher passes book. There you go. Passes book.
You weren't supposed to see that.
Strange Stars. So he's not gonna be interviewed by anyone inept, i.e. me. He's just gonna tell us all about how he's come together with this book. But we're delighted to welcome Jason to Walthamstow. It's his first ever trip to Europe. He's actually been touring Europe because he's in a band, and his band is called
Weathered Statues.
Weathered Statues.
Yes.
And he's been out playing gigs all over Europe, and he's stopped off in the UK to sell some books. What sells more, Jason, books or records? Where are you going to become rich from?
Yeah, well, I'm going to become slightly less poor from selling books, I think. Yes. Yes.
I have said to Jason that we would give him a very warm welcome, a London and a Walthamstow welcome. So please, ladies and gentlemen, Jason.
Thanks. And my friend Tom Clayton from my publisher Melville House is going to say a couple words before I speak. So Tom, yeah, what do you have to say there, buddy?
Well, yeah, welcome everyone. Thank you all for coming out. Having seen Jason speaking in Bristol last night, I know you're all in for quite a treat, and it's my job as the publisher to tell you all to buy the book afterwards. I'm sure that Jason will do a great job of convincing you to do so. Strange Stars is quite an extraordinary journey through the cosmic 70s, covering everything from Bowie to Hendrix to everything weird in between, even some novelty disco records thrown in there as well. So I hope you're ready to hear about some amazing music and some amazing books and everything else. So yeah, off you go. Originally we were going to interview Jason, but I think, to be honest, you're just primed and ready, aren't you?
Yeah, I'm just going to you guys.
All right, well, go for it, buddy.
Great. Well, thank you so much, everyone. Appreciate it. Okay, well, thank you. So yes, my name is Jason Heller. I'm here from Denver, Colorado. I did just get done with a 2-week tour of Europe with my band, and so it is very interesting to be here and not seeing a bunch of anarchists. Not that I have anything against them, but yeah, so I'm having a little bit of a gear shift here in audience. And I am here not to play music, but to talk about music, and in particular, the science fiction influenced music of the 1970s. That is the subject of my book, Strange Stars, subtitle being David Bowie, Pop Music, and the Decade Sci-Fi Exploded. Now, myself, besides playing music, strictly as a hobby, really, I am a music journalist, and I spent a good portion of my younger years working in an independent record store in Denver called Wax Trax Records, where, in addition to occasionally selling a record to someone, I sat around on a stool with fellow music nerds who I worked with, and we would listen to music, since we had this vast library of music in the record store at our disposal, and theorize about music, what it meant to us, what it meant to society at large. And in a lot of ways, that was kind of the university I went to when it came to music journalism. After working at a record store for so long, I began working for various publications as a freelance writer, doing music journalism and music criticism, and most recently, I've been doing a lot of writing for places like Rolling Stone, NPR in the US, The Atlantic, The New Yorker. And as I have been given a little bit more leeway to write about the topics that are most dear to me, the last few years I found myself really gravitating toward this particular topic of how two things I love so much, popular music and science fiction, had this bit of a crossover that might seem small or insignificant to the world of music criticism at large, but to me has always been a very large, a very vast and fertile playground for not just imaginative music, but a type of narrative, a type of storytelling in music form that certain science fiction influenced musicians, David Bowie very much included, have really grasped and have really developed in a way that I didn't feel got enough recognition, particularly in the world of science fiction. I myself am a Hugo Award-winning editor, and in that realm of science fiction and the science fiction community, there isn't really a lot of recognition given to the medium of music as a form of science fiction storytelling, as just as legitimate a way of expressing ideas about technology, society, the present, the future. These are things that so many musicians have tackled in such serious ways, and it does not get the props that I think it's due. The Hugo Awards being science fiction's highest accolades given out every year really have made progress in so many other areas in recognizing not just literature, but film, TV, graphic novels, podcasts, so many forms of expression. And music always remains one that is just never really explored from the viewpoint of the science fiction community. So from that standpoint, that always kind of frustrated me. But also as a music critic, I have been increasingly dismayed over the years at how little the music critic community and the discourse about popular music fails to take into account or even acknowledge the importance of science fiction and the ideas of futurism when it comes to some of the most famous and popular musicians in the canon of rock and roll and pop music. So all these things kind of were swirling around in my head. And a few years ago, I pitched an idea to the 33 1/3 book series, which, if you're not familiar, is a series of tiny books that each covers one album in music history and talks about how the album was made, the album's importance, its impact, its legacy. I pitched one of those to 33 1/3, and the very first album that popped into my mind when I was trying to think about what I was going to pitch was David Bowie's 1972 science fiction concept album, The Rise and Fall of Ziggy Stardust and the Spiders from Mars. I pitched it to 33 1/3 specifically as an examination of that album as a work of science fiction, as something that should be considered part of the science fiction canon, regardless of the medium that it was released in and conceived in, which of course was the record LP. That pitch was flatly turned down by 33 1/3, and it definitely energized me at that point, as any good rejection ought to when you're a writer, right? Where I was like, well, okay, if 33 1/3 is going to reject this absolutely penetrating and brilliant idea I have about David Bowie, I'm going to find someone else who might let me write about this at length, to the point where I can actually expand this idea beyond just that album, beyond just David Bowie. And so I was lucky enough to eventually land this idea with the publisher Melville House. And was at work. The beginnings of this book had already taken shape in January of 2016 when David Bowie died, and as we all remember, was an unexpected death. He had not publicly revealed his illness. And the fact that not only did his death come as a blow to so many of us who are fans of him and his music, it was the fact that his final album, Black Star, released just a few days before his death, had been one of his periodic returns in many ways to some of these themes of science fiction that he'd been expressing in his music, actually even before Space Oddity in 1969. He had been writing and releasing science fiction theme songs before that, before he had even made much of a mark as an artist in the popular consciousness at all. What I wanted to do at that point, even though Strange Stars was already underway, was hopefully do as much as I could to honor this idea of David Bowie as someone who, yes, is the multifaceted creator and entertainer and icon that we all know, but it was also a fan and interpreter and creator of science fiction who has never been given the due in that regard. That a lot of times when his work in the science fiction field is mentioned, it's mentioned not necessarily with a lot of depth or analysis or context as to where that came from and why he did it and what it meant to the world of science fiction and the world of popular music, that there was someone who was having hits seriously addressing issues that came up regularly in the genre of science fiction literature, that someone was approaching those ideas in song and in album and doing it in a way that was influencing so many other musicians. That was pretty much how Strange Stars came together. Now, there's also, as with almost anyone who writes a book, anything like this, there's going to be a personal element that is kind of one of the driving factors. And as a kid growing up, I was a very big David Bowie fan, but beyond that, the first concert I ever saw as a kid was David Bowie in the 80s, and it was the infamous Glass Spider Tour. And I write a little bit about this in the introduction to the book, if you've read it, and actually wrote an essay about this for The Atlantic recently, defending the much maligned, unfairly maligned Glass Spider Tour of 1987, because as a lot of Bowie fans then at the time and in hindsight have said, that is considered a very low point, if not the lowest point in Bowie's career by many fans, for the fact that at that point he seemed to be coasting, and there was a very wide gulf between the level of creativity that seemed to be going into his music and performances at the time and the extravagant, even for Bowie, stage show and lighting and costuming that was going on that tour. All the critics of the Glass Spider Tour are wrong. They completely have no idea what they're talking about, because it is one of the most amazing periods, in my opinion, of Bowie's career. That opinion is in no way colored by the fact that that was my first concert, of course, completely objectively speaking. But to me, there was something very special about the fact of seeing an artist that I had been enjoying only on record for years at that young point in my life, and seeing not just the hugeness and the spectacle of what he was doing in the Glass Spider Tour, but the elements of science fiction and the fantastic and the weird that were being brought to life in massive terms. I mean, this was a set that contained a 60-foot giant spider from which David Bowie was lowered onto stage, and that's just the beginning. I mean, that's like the first 5 minutes of the concert, and it just kind of went from there. So to me, there were so many points along the way of my young life where David Bowie imprinted himself on me as not just a pop star and someone whose music spoke to me in so many ways, but someone who embodied these ideas of otherness, strangeness, weirdness, otherworldliness. Many of the same reasons that I was a science fiction fan at the exact same time. So as I tried to kind of wrangle these ideas into an outline for a book, what I also began to notice was how little I actually knew about the topic of science fiction influenced music. I wanted to contain the book to the 1970s for a pretty specific reason, which was David Bowie's Space Oddity came out in 1969, and the sequel to that song, Ashes to Ashes, came out in 1980. And that is the song, of course, where David Bowie returns to the character of Major Tom that he had introduced in Space Oddity. And 1969 and 1980, in between, is very neatly sandwiched the 1970s. But the more I dug into things, the more I realized that there was an entire spectrum of music released in that decade, beyond even what I had dug up in all my years sitting behind a counter at a record store, pondering these things with my friends that I worked with. There was a narrative here. There were points that I could connect, and there were a lot of parallels that were actually happening between what was going on in science fiction influenced music, not just parallels to that and science fiction in other media, but what was going on in the space program at the time throughout the 70s, from the late 60s up through the early 80s, and what was going on in the other areas of technology and science throughout the 70s, with the introduction of so many new types of devices and ideas, the fact that there was a resurgence and a refinement of the fear of the future that took its most concrete form in the book Future Shock by Alvin Toffler, which became a touchstone for quite a few musicians as well. While not being a work of science fiction, was a work of speculative nonfiction that talked about the acceleration of technology and where that might bring us as a civilization by the end of the 20th century and beyond. A very alarmist book, and in hindsight, in many ways, a little bit of a silly book, but one that at the time encapsulated a lot of the fears, anxieties that people had about technology advancing to such a degree that it might outpace human society's ability to actually keep up with it. So I wanted to bring all of those things together onto kind of a timeline and tell this story. And so with Strange Stars, I hope I did that. But what the most important thing to me about this book, and I hope anyone who reads it takes this away with them, is this was a process of discovery for me very much. There were the artists that I already knew and loved that I instantly knew were going to be in the book besides David Bowie. Of course I knew Hawkwind was going to be in it. Of course Kraftwerk, Blue Oyster Cult, Parliament, Devo, X-Ray Specs, Gary Newman. You know, these were all groups and artists that had to be in the book. But I came across so many groups that I had no idea about. In addition to these big famous artists who released groundbreaking works of music in the 70s for various reasons, but also happened to be influenced and or expressive of science fiction, there were these little groups that most of us have never heard of. A small group that was only around for a couple years of soul musicians and singers called the Continental Four, for instance, from the East Coast of the United States, who in 1972 released a single called Escape from Planet Earth, which in all of my research I have concluded is the first true science fiction funk song, and there have been quite a lot. So in 1972, we have this band, the Continental Four, releasing this song, Escape from Planet Earth, which years and years before the term Afrofuturism had been coined, had a song about African Americans leaving the Earth to start a new civilization on another planet that was going to rebuild a ruined civilization in such a way that was going to learn from the mistakes and bypass the mistakes that had been made here on Earth. There were, and complete with a spoken word introduction between the spaceship and ground control that is absolutely amazing, with spacey sound effects. Everything about it, it has all the hallmarks of what George Clinton in Parliament would later do. Not taken to so much of a sonic or conceptual extreme as what Parliament and Funkadelic did, but the seeds of it were there. So for every artist like Bowie or George Clinton or Gary Newman that I talk about in the book, there are the people that did things on a similar level, but have been completely unsung for their efforts. And getting to discover and tell some of those stories was really one of the greatest joys of writing this book. You know, that I got to dig up Julian J. Savarin of the progressive rock band Julian's Treatment in the early 70s, who made one of the most amazing science fiction concept records, and for me, one of, if not the first, true science fiction concept rock albums in the year 1970, when they really exploded as such, particularly with Magma's first album in France. But Julian J. Savarin and Julian's Treatment had an amazing mix of original science fiction concepts and also direct references to the work of Isaac Asimov, in particular his Foundation series, and did it in a way that didn't feel like pastiche, that actually felt like a completely new type of storytelling in musical form, and that used rock music in a way that wasn't just kind of a stock progressive sound that you might have heard in the 1970s, but was really trying to be the sonic equivalent of some of these cosmic ideas and atmospheres that were being sung about lyrically. Now, the great thing about someone like Julian J. Savarin is, even though he's more or less unknown, to me he's a great example of someone who recognized that there were so many similarities between telling stories in musical form and also in other media. So he was someone who became so frustrated with how difficult it was to try to write science fiction concept albums, have them released, and have them appreciated as such, that he gave up on music altogether and just continued the stories that he began in his music in a series of novels, which also weren't very popular either, but that was the attempt he made, and that was the vision that he had, that he was above all a storyteller, and it was a matter of which medium was going to work best for him as he carried things over. Throughout Strange Stars, there's a lot of examples of artists who did that. You know, Mick Farren of the Deviants, another great example of someone who wound up starting in music but writing science fiction novels. Michael Moorcock, probably the prominent example of someone, while known primarily for the music or for the books that he wrote, had a music career and would bring some of his ideas and storylines and characters from some of his fiction into his band, The Deep Fix, as well as some of the songs that he wrote lyrics for both Hawkwind and Blue Oyster Cult. So I wanted to talk in this book about that conversation that was being had in the 70s between the science fiction counterculture and the rock counterculture. And you know, I'm glad I got to dive into some of the stories, particularly of people like Paul Kantner of Jefferson Airplane and Jefferson Starship, who are bands that, again, are very well known and renowned in rock and roll history, but not for science fiction, even though that's something that Paul Kantner relentlessly and obsessively put into his work throughout his entire career, all the way until his death. And he's recognized for so many other accomplishments that his bands made, but not that one. It was something that he wanted to be known for so much, was the fact that he was a science fiction fan and he considered himself a science fiction author in song. Mark Bolan of T-Rex would call himself often in interviews a science fiction author who just happened to write songs. And again, it's not the first thing that a lot of people think of when they think of Mark Bolan, even though that is something he wanted to be remembered as. So getting to kind of tell these alternate histories and sketch some of these alternate portraits of some artists maybe a lot of people have never heard of, and a lot of ones that people maybe know very dearly, but just have not been examined from that point of view before. That was really one of the thrills of doing this book. Having a cover like this was absolutely something that was not a disappointment either, and I couldn't be happier with that because anyone here who has had a book published knows that you're not always in charge or in any way really consulted about what the cover of the book is going to be. And it was very great that one of my favorite contemporary authors, Butcher Billy, completely unknown to me, was the one who was commissioned to do the cover for this book, which me also being a big comic book nerd, I used to work in a comic book store as well as in a music store. That's the font from the Gold Key Star Trek comics from the 1970s that is just appropriated for Strange Stars. So I'm triggered in the best possible way when I see that. Yeah, yes, yes. Now I want to read just a really, really brief section of the book, and I would love anyone who might have a question or an observation or really anything they might want to share or ask about any of these topics, David Bowie obviously being kind of the most obvious one. Think about if there's something you might want to ask or bring up at any point here when I'm done reading this brief little excerpt. It doesn't have to be a question, it can just be something you feel like sharing. I'd absolutely be happy to hear it, I'm sure we all would. And of course, afterwards, I'll be signing copies of the book, and we'll have them for sale for anyone who might be interested. And if you'd like to see this all again, I guess I'm going to be in London tomorrow as well. Yeah, 2 nights. I have yet to have any Strange Stars groupies, so we'll see if that happens. So I want to read a little bit. One of my favorite parts also about writing this book was getting to re-examine the discography of David Bowie, which I have loved for so long, but getting to listen to it specifically with a rock and roll as well as science fiction lens. And Ziggy Stardust is always, going to pop into my mind, along with Space Oddity as Bowie's foremost works of science fiction. But what was most rewarding to me was getting to dive into his album Diamond Dogs, which of course was also a science fiction concept album. And it's another record that some Bowie fans love, some Bowie fans are not huge fans of, a lot of times is considered, and to me as a music critic, I hate this designation because it seems like really a glib dismissal of a work that might otherwise be interesting. The whole idea was a great idea, but maybe poorly executed. I hate that description of anything. I think it's absolutely the laziest way of looking at something. And I hear that all the time about Diamond Dogs. Great idea, maybe not so greatly executed. Like, what exactly does that mean? Let's pick that apart a bit. Me especially, I adore that album. And I think it's absolutely just an atmospheric and frightening piece of work that continues to reward me the more I listen to it. If you haven't listened to Diamond Dogs lately, please go back and listen to it. I'm going to talk a little bit, read a little bit from the book about that album. And yeah. David Bowie darted around his conjoined hotel suites at the Venerable Pierre in Manhattan's Upper East Side. Instead of a guitar, he wielded scissors and glue. Movie cameras and video editing equipment were strewn throughout the rooms. He'd been in New York just a few days. He'd trekked up from Philadelphia, where he'd been recording his upcoming album, Young Americans. The plan was to finish working on Young Americans at the famed Record Plant Studio in New York. On this night, however, Bowie wasn't obsessing over his current album in progress, or even entertaining his habitual retinue of groupies with images from his most recent record, Diamond Dogs, dancing through his mind. He was instead building a model in his hotel room. Diamond Dogs came out in May of 1974, and its vision of a post-apocalyptic urban hellscape had come to consume him. In New York, he was surrounded by skyrocketing crime and urban decay. A nationwide recession in the U.S. deepened in the wake of 1973's stock market crash. The oil crisis was fueling global unrest and fears of long-term energy scarcity, while Richard Nixon's resignation in August laid bare the fragility of American democracy. In this context, Diamond Dogs resonated. Bowie wanted to turn Diamond Dogs into a movie. In an interview years later, he recalled that he wanted that film set in a world ravaged by fuel shortages and populated by cyborgs. He knew he needed a treatment of some kind to show Hollywood producers, but rather than typing up a simple synopsis, he rented camera equipment and hired a film crew to come to his suites at the Pierre. There they would capture on celluloid a half-hour teaser for the big screen adaptation of Diamond Dogs as Bowie envisioned it. The model he was building for the teaser was of a city. It was called Hunger City, a crumbling metropolis rife with social and economic collapse where, according to Future Legend, the album's ominous opening track, corpses lay rotting on the slimy thoroughfare. From the tops of skyscrapers, red mutant eyes gazed down on the city's scavenging tribes of barely human survivors. Melody Maker called the song Doom Through Science Fiction. In his hotel, Bowie hung a piece of black fabric. When his model of Hunger City was finished, he installed it in front of that canvas, evoking an aura of eternal night. Then, as his producer Tony Visconti remembered, he videoed his set for 30 minutes against that black cloth backdrop. Afterwards, he played back the tape, and he walked against the black cloth and narrated his own story treatment. We combined the pre-recorded tape and live David, many times reduced, onto a second machine via the console, and it appeared as if he was actually in the city. The Lilliputian-sized David was at the right scale for the set, and it all looked very convincing. Visconti never saw this film again, and it's never surfaced since. One can only imagine the stupefying strangeness of a low-budget short film starring a miniaturized David Bowie, strolling through his own handmade model of the dystopian Hunger City, sterile skyscrapers looming, and red mutant eyes gazing down. So yeah, somewhere in Bowie's vaults, hopefully, maybe unearthed someday, is this short that Bowie made, hoping to interest a Hollywood producer in making a feature-length film. out of Diamond Dogs, which I can only imagine. So yeah, that's basically what I had to say about Strange Stars. Did anyone have any questions or anything that they would like to bring up? Yeah.
Is Metropolis the first film you think that influenced?
I would say
It's the first one, isn't it?
I would say it's probably the earliest one that I write about in the book that had a significant influence.
And do you think Dan Dare had an influence on
Dan Dare had a huge
David
influence.
Bowie and people of that era?
Yeah,
Of that age, sorry.
Yeah, absolutely. There are numerous examples in the book of people who were influenced. Elton John had a song with Dan Dare in it, and then of course it seemed like lots of the punk generation. You know, Mekons obviously got their the name of their band from Dan Dare. The Rosillos cite Dan Dare as a big influence on their kind of more campy, cartoony science fiction punk rock. So yeah, very much. And there are other examples in the book too of the big influence that Dan Dare had, of course, on that generation of British musicians. Yeah. Yes.
Since you mentioned punk, I was going to ask about how you think the science fiction, the way that the science fiction influence works, changes when you get, you know, into the sort of punk era, because obviously there were punk bands or new wave bands who were influenced by science fiction. My favourite band, The Fall, being an example. But
yes, absolutely.
But yeah, I mean, you know, what?
Yeah. Well, I write about this pretty extensively in the book, but in a nutshell, you know, punk rock in 1976, 1977 couldn't have had less of a use for science fiction, especially as it was associated at the time musically with all things progressive. But it didn't take very long for punk groups to start realizing that there was a different way that you could approach science fiction other than using it as this kind of cosmic subject matter. And Marky Smith, of course, and The Fall are mentioned in here in that regard. But what really was one of the interesting pivots when it came to this was also the pivot from punk to post-punk. Specifically in the fact that that the synthesizer became something that, like science fiction, had been associated with progressive rock. But by 1978, the fact that synthesizers were becoming smaller, cheaper, more accessible, more portable, it was a way to have even less musical ability than you needed to play in a punk band. You didn't even need to know a chord. I mean, you could build a synthesizer and you needed one finger. And you had a profusion of bands, of course, from Cabaret Voltaire to the Human League and on, who were using more the native sound of the synthesizer as basically this kind of future noise-making unit rather than a way to approximate you know, the sounds and the structures of, say, classical music. And so that became a way to express a new kind of futurism and a new kind of science fiction in music. One that, as I mentioned, wasn't necessarily obsessed with more the cosmic angle of things. It was bringing things down to a much more immediate and relatable level to the type of technology that was existing really kind of at our fingertips at the time. You know, we got to remember that the 1970s was the time when genetic engineering was becoming something viable, when home computers were first hitting the market. There was a downsizing, in a way, of science fiction, in a way that authors like Philip K. Dick and J.G. Ballard had been doing for a period at that point, that in the same way that so many of the punk musicians were rejecting what had gone on musically in rock music for the decade or so earlier, the science fiction influenced musicians of the post-punk era were rejecting the types of science fiction, the types of Golden Age, Robert Heinlein, Arthur C. Clarke, Isaac Asimov type of science fiction, and going for stuff that was often more about maybe softer sciences than astrophysics or quantum physics. That all of a sudden we're talking about what genetic engineering, what artificial organs, what things that were actually, in being put into practice in reality in the world, where those things might lead us. Even the way that, the science of statistics and information and data science, we're beginning to shape in a completely new way the way we're being marketed to and the way we consume. To me, it's one of the brilliant things about the band X-Ray Specs, and why they're one of the most important bands that I put in the book, because Polly Styrene, the singer of X-Ray Specs, so intuitively grasped and so brilliantly grasped how there was this shift at the time in the way people were beginning to view the future and think about the future and approach technology. That really became just commonplace by the time the 80s began. But X-Ray Specs' album, Germ-Free Adolescence, is one I devote a considerable amount of space to in the book, as being an album that in and of itself kind of bridges punk and post-punk, is a little bit of both, and that also really firmly takes the rebellion and the iconoclasm of punk rock, but isn't just doing that at face value or shock value or for its own sake, that there is actually something that's much more emotionally resonant, even as it's kind of colder and frightening about the future and about technology that's being explored in that. So to me, that was kind of what was going on. And there's plenty of other bands too, that played such a huge part in it, Ultravox being a really important one. And then by the time Gary Newman came along with Tubeway Army and began turning synth pop into something that was a very blatant sonic metaphor for the alienation of technology. And by that point, what we begin to think of as the 80s, has coalesced, and is kind of where my book ends chronologically. But yeah, that was one of the most fascinating parts of the whole book for me to write about, because that's personally such a near and dear era of music to me. And as you mentioned, it is a point where there was a huge shift in not just the way musicians were viewing the future, but in the way that they were using technology to express that. Yes.
I've got a couple of questions.
Yeah.
I know you mentioned about Dan Dare comic book,
Yeah.
but the Flash Gordon TV series
Yeah.
that was on in the 30s, I think. I mean, they showed it here when I was a kid.
Yeah.
So that was like a Saturday morning viewing. I don't know if that had any impact on it.
It had a huge impact on a man named Jimi Hendrix. So as I write about, so the book takes place. Strange Stars is the 70s, as I mentioned, but the first chapter is kind of about the end of the 60s, and the last chapter is sort of the beginning of the 80s. And so at the end of the 60s chapter, I talk at length about Jimi Hendrix and the fact that yet another artist so legendary and so well known and influential, yet every aspect of his work has been explored except really the science fictional aspect, which is prevalent in his music. It's something that he loved and read voraciously, and cited specific works of science fiction in some of his songs. But he so loved the early Flash Gordon serials, and I'm thinking that what were serialized on movie screens in the U.S. are the ones that were shown on TV over here, the Buster Crab.
Yeah, you got the ship on wire.
Yep. Jimi Hendrix, as a boy, insisted on being called Buster. He didn't want to be called Jimmy. He insisted on being called Buster because he was such a huge fan of Buster Crab and of Flash Gordon that he, for a while, yeah, he wanted to be called Buster. This was at a time when he, at a very young age, began recording UFO experiences that he believed that he was seeing. Something that, of course, cropped up in his work after he became a songwriter. So yeah, especially though that era of science fiction film, again, it was with the punks who a certain strain of them developed into post-punk and were kind of looking at a new kind of science fiction in this very earnest way. But then there was also the whole idea of punks taking kind of the pulpy or campy era, as they viewed it, of science fiction and celebrating it for that. Celebrating the fact that here were predictions of the future that looked completely antiquated already by the end of the 70s. And that's where you have not only bands like the Rezillos, but the B-52s, the Cramps, the Misfits, who were all kind of working a lot of this into their music by the end of the 70s, as I mentioned in the book. So yeah, it is kind of an unusual way that sort of filtered in. But yeah, for sure, that was an influence.
Yes, just prompted this question. On balance, dystopia or utopia? What's the dominant
Which is better?
theme?
The dominant theme is definitely dystopia. There are utopias here and there. Paul Kantner of Jefferson Airplane released an album in 1970, a solo album called Blows Against the Empire, which wound up being the first album of original popular music nominated for a Hugo Award in 1971. And it wasn't until last year that another record of original popular music was nominated for a Hugo Award. There's a rap group called Clipping from the States, and they're most famous for the fact that their MC, David Diggs, is one of the original cast members of Hamilton. And Paul Kantner's Blows Against the Empire is utopian in a sense, but it's utopian in the face of a dystopian Earth. It's utopian in the sense that there is, like so many of these science fiction narratives, are almost biblical in the idea that there is going to be an exodus from Earth that is going to deliver some form of chosen people into the stars to restart civilization, to reboot humanity. But most of the utopias that are expressed in science fiction music of the 70s are done so from the ashes of a dystopia. And that dystopia is usually us, our current civilization. So it's always a little bit of a backhanded utopia. It's not exactly our world having magically and by our own power made better. But dystopia, when you think about cinema and you think about the literature of science fiction in the 70s, was absolutely obsessed with dystopia, especially the beginning of the 70s, before Star Wars came along and revolutionized what people expected to see in their science fiction. So a lot of the musicians really followed suit. Dystopia kind of became the default setting for a lot of science fiction music throughout the decade. What was interesting, though, is a lot of the dystopian records that came out earlier in the 70s simply depicted a dystopia that usually had some roots in our world, whether it was literally our world in the future or a thinly veiled allegory of our world. Say, for instance, 2112 by Rush, which takes place on an alien planet, but is clearly meant to mirror so many of our contemporary trends and pitfalls just projected into the future. But what I love by the end of the 70s is you do have groups like Ultravox and Gary Newman and Two-Way Army who are still trafficking in these ideas of dystopia. But what they're doing is, rather than painting it as kind of this horror show, rather than doing this kind of dystopia porn, where we're going to gawk at how horrible it is and be frightened by it, what people like Ultravox and Gary Newman were doing, so John Fox and Gary Newman were basically presenting themselves as if they were characters in a dystopian world already, that this had already come to pass, that this was the here and now, and that they were simply, in a cold, dispassionate way, reporting what they were seeing around them, as if they were kind of the canary in the coal mine of these dystopian near futures. And in such, there isn't even so much of a judgment against a lot of these. It's almost as if it's matter-of-fact journalism about the horrors of what can be seen, or the horrors embraced as joys, and alienation embraced rather than and idealized, rather than being something to be frightened of. That is more chilling to me, and I feel that was the intention of a lot of these artists as well, to kind of to play with that, to not make necessarily a moral or value judgment, because that seemed rote at that point. That finger wagging and alarmism and cautionary tales weren't really where the world was headed, that it was instead a way that you can use satire in the sense of The Fall, or you can use absurdism, or simply a chilling embrace of dystopia. And it is a very nihilistic way of looking at things, and you do listen to a lot of that music, and it can come across that way in the most beautiful way. So to me, dystopia was definitely kind of the dominant thing at the time, in music as well as in other forms of science fiction. But the way that it was used changed and was used from different viewpoints throughout the decade.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yes.
Where do you see the influence of science fiction now? Is it predominant in any one genre? Because I'm struggling to think of anything that I can...
Yeah, there are a lot of artists today, a lot of bands and artists who are using science fiction in their music, in their imagery, in their videos, in their albums. The thing is, there are mostly the genres of R&B and rap and heavy metal that you're going to find these in most often. There are plenty of other examples in any genre of music you could see, but those, and it's funny because, heavy metal, for the most part, as much as I love it, and there's so much wealth of great heavy metal being made now, both above ground and underground, it's still very much a traditional genre of music, even when it is progressive to a certain extent. Whereas R&B and particularly hip-hop are the most progressive form of pop that's out there right now, and the most adventurous. The person who always kind of winds up rising to the top of any list like that in my mind is Janelle Monáe right now. Not only in the fact that she very obviously and vocally incorporates science fiction into her work, but it is the way that she talks about science fiction and the way that she cites canonical works of science fiction and authors when she's speaking about her work. And the way that she, maybe as with no artist since David Bowie, is kind of poised at becoming someone who has accrued a cult following that has gradually become a mainstream following and might actually have the ability to port a lot of these concepts to a much broader audience than might otherwise they might otherwise reach, and just normalizing the idea that science fiction and futurism is something that can inherently be part of the pop music experience, and maybe ought to be. There are, you know, a lot of people, especially over the last 15, 18 years, who've been doing, you know, some amazing things, but they don't seem to be having a conversation with each other in terms of thinking about a community or a scene or a shared aesthetic, that it is just kind of a lot of lone wolves sort of doing their own thing. And I would love to see at some point, you know, some of these groups find a way to connect and build the consciousness about what it is they're doing, rather than it just being them and their fans, you know what I mean, who are kind of privy to the science fictional aspect of what they're doing. So I mean, that remains to be seen. I certainly hope that's the case at some point. Yeah.
Oh, hi. So this is a kind of comment, really, a question.
Yeah.
I did enjoy the book very much.
Thank you.
It was really comprehensive. And kind of, for me, having lived through the late 60s and 70s that you talk about, I very much resonate with a lot of the stuff that you talk about. Like, I kind of lived through the, and this is a kind of sin, I suppose, really. I lived through the 70s pretty much ignoring Bowie.
Yeah.
And my touchstones were people like Hawkwind, Clarkesworld.
Yeah.
I suppose the kind of other emerging bands such as Two-Way Army, etc., etc. But I wondered whether, because I guess what I get from your book is it's very much a reflection of the science fiction genre. I don't see the way the music itself is really affecting the kind of genre in itself and the actual discourse and the tropes themselves.
Yeah.
And I wondered if you could do a thought experiment whereby you take Bowie out. Bowie didn't exist
Oh,
in the
interesting.
70s, and then you look at the impact on the discourse as a wider thing. Because I can see the substance, I can see in Jobriath, and I can see in Gary Newman, you know, the wannabes almost wanting to kind of emulate the discourse and the way he's kind of representing themselves.
Yeah.
I don't see the further impacts, and I wondered if in that thought experiment, you know, what the impact would really be.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. It's something I thought about a lot when I was getting the book together and had some pretty lengthy editorial discussions with Melville House about, are we going to talk about, like, you know, there's this one-way street of how science fiction is influencing music. Was it reciprocal? Was there a circuit completed here? And was there a way that what was happening in music was also having an effect on science fiction at large? And the decision came to not explore that direction, mostly because it actually didn't really exist too much. There were countless musicians, as I recount in the book, who were very attuned to science fiction, whether it was something nostalgic from their youth, or whether it was something that had continued on into adulthood as a serious passion. But there weren't a whole lot of science fiction authors that were that tuned in to what was going on in music. The big exception being the new wave of science fiction led by Michael Moorcock.
Ballard, that's right. Yeah.
Yep, though Ballard hated rock and roll. He absolutely, he hated it. And you know, he never remarked on it, but the fact that so many post-punk artists have cited J.G. Ballard, referenced his work, you know, from Comsat Angels to Joy Division to the Buggles even, you know, on and on and on. You know, Ballard would have hated every single one of those bands, just like you know, Rush's 2112 was devoted to Ayn Rand, and she would have hated it because she thought rock and roll was horrible noise, not worthy of a noble human being. So, of course, what did she know? But yeah, there was not as much of an impact. You know, you do have stray works that popped up here and there. You know, one of my favorites is Brian Aldiss's The Brothers of the Head. You know, a novella of his that came out, I think, in about '75, which is a really beautifully gonzo little book about rock and roll, but that is a science fiction book in essence. That, while vastly entertaining to anyone who is very tied in to that era of science fiction and that era of music, is not something I think that really has aged necessarily very well. Granted, not a lot of science fiction has, depending. You know, the stuff that has aged well, we all hear about. The vast amounts of it that haven't aged well are things that we don't hear about so often. But yeah, it's usually been, there have been lots of examples here and there, but they're isolated for the most part. And I think it was because socially there was not that big of a crossover between the people who created science fiction and the rock and roll world. There's an anecdote that you might remember since you've read the book that maybe illustrates this a bit. In 1975, Gene Roddenberry, of course, it had been years since Star Trek had been canceled, and Star Trek, the animated series, you know, came and went and didn't make much of an impact, didn't revive the Star Trek franchise in the way that Star Trek fans and Roddenberry wanted to do. So at that point, he was basically just appearing at Star Trek conventions, which were becoming increasingly bigger and more popular, and taking speaking appearances for a couple $100 here and there at universities. And the irony being, his greatest success, Star Trek, was also keeping him from getting steady work in TV and film, because people only wanted him to do science fiction, even though he had worked in numerous genres, you know, westerns, detective stories, everything before he had started doing science fiction. So he would do a science fiction pilot here and there that would go nowhere. So Roddenberry was in kind of a really tough spot in the mid-'70s. And it was kind of at one of the lowest points in his career before Hollywood greenlit Star Trek the Motion Picture and revived the Star Trek franchise. He gets a call from Paul McCartney, who is going to be in Los Angeles doing a concert with Wings, and Paul McCartney would like Gene Roddenberry to be his special guest backstage to watch the Wings concert. And you got to think, at that point Roddenberry was at least 50, or late 40s perhaps. I'm in my late 40s, so I don't say that as a bad thing. But it was one of those things where it was Gene Roddenberry probably did not go home and listen to Wings on a regular basis, right? Yet Paul McCartney summons him to this Wings concert. After the concert, Paul McCartney comes directly off stage, goes up to Gene Roddenberry, and basically treats Gene Roddenberry as if he were Paul McCartney. He goes up and just geeks out on him. He shakes his hand. He's like, I'm so happy to meet you. Oh, I'm such a huge fan. And Gene Roddenberry is just there, kind of dumbstruck by all this. Well, as it turns out, Paul McCartney had an ulterior motive, which was he wanted to do a concept album about Wings that was going to be a battle of the bands that took place in outer space, and Wings was going to be one of the bands. And it was going to be this whole storyline. It was going to be like Eurovision in outer space. And it was starring Wings, and he wanted to hire Paul McCartney to write the story behind this, and that it, you know, maybe it was going to be something that was going to have a multimedia element to it, a very ambitious project. Paul McCartney, or Gene Roddenberry, of course, said yes. At that point, he was just basically taking any job he could. The fact that it was one of the biggest rock stars in the world, personally asking him to do a project for him, he absolutely said yes. And apparently, there is a sheaf of notes of this treatment of this idea and story notes that Paul McCartney, or that Gene Roddenberry had taken down, fleshing out Paul McCartney's idea for this cosmic battle of the bands with wings. That, of course, was abandoned. I mean, you know, how many ideas like that have come up, especially in the 70s, you know, when every conceptual extravagance a rock band could imagine was given the green light. So, yeah, somewhere in a file, probably in Gene Roddenberry's things, yet another thing like Bowie's trailer for Diamond Dogs that hopefully would get unearthed sometime. But to me, that was really an indication of how little community-wise there was any commonality between what was going on in the science fiction world and what was going on in popular music. It took something that kind of unusual to happen for there to be a bit of a dialogue, or for even someone like Gene Roddenberry to, you know, what's the episode of the Star Trek, the original series, where there's the space hippies? You know what I mean? Now I'm trying to remember the title of that episode. But yeah, obviously Roddenberry was a little tone deaf when it came to contemporary pop culture. You know, that wasn't the whole gist of what Roddenberry was going for. And it wasn't, in a lot of ways, it was an age thing. You know, the average age of the rock musician in the mid-70s versus the average age of the working science fiction author. You know, you might be talking about a difference of 15 years, if not more, on average. And so that definitely factored into it a bit. But I also think it was part of the fact that, again, science fiction music wasn't being recognized. If there had been a category on the Hugo ballot after Paul Kantner's, when Paul Kantner's Blows Against the Empire was nominated for a Hugo Award, it was under this generic category of Best Dramatic Presentation, which could basically include anything in any medium. And so, without a dedicated spot for the recognition of science fiction music, the chances of an album being recognized by the Hugos just plummeted. And that ballot has been revised numerous times throughout the decades, so it's not something that's out of the realm of possibility. So if that had happened, that might have had a different bit of an impact, for sure. Anything else? Yes.
Sorry to stop all the questions.
Please, please.
The store did close over an hour ago. Could we make one last question? Or, this is going to be my offer, we normally invite our authors to come for a pint. And if Jason has, I don't know, if you have some time, Tom, an hour to spend, there's a couple of places in Walthamstow I'd like to show him, including Mirth, Marble and Maud. And everyone is, of course, welcome to join us and chat Strange Stars with Jason now.
Yeah, absolutely.
But we are about selling books as well. We do have very limited quantity,
yes.
I'm afraid. Only 15 copies of Strange Stars available, and that isn't enough to go round. So hopefully this evening, Jason has made a compelling argument for purchasing it. Will remain to be seen. But ladies and gentlemen, can we have a big round of applause for Jason Heller?
Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you. I really appreciate it.
Time left, so that must go as well. The deal is, if you would like to purchase a book, just grab a book, Jason will sign it, and you can pay for it downstairs at the till. I think they're £20. Is that right? How much is the book? £20. It says on the back. Maybe Jason will do you a deal, I don't know.
Yeah.
That's all right. I'll still go. I'll watch it back. It's already got that in.
I might join them in the pub. My favourite man, Chubby Harryhausen. He's just my favourite. Whenever they want, I'm just like.
It's magical. Well, it's Marvin.
I think rather like the burritos.
Yeah, they do.
Well, I don't know.
Thank you very much. Can I pay you downstairs?
Downstairs.
Oh,